On March 18, 2024, as the Connecticut General Assembly revived a tsunami of anti-neighborhoods and anti-local zoning bills, many of which had gone down in flames in previous year's sessions. CT169Strong produced an informative webinar about these zombie bills, moderated by Alexis Harrison, co-founder and president of CT169Strong and a Fairfield Planning and Zoning Commissioner. Joined by co-founder and New Canaan Board of Finance member Maria Weingarten, Westport RTM Chair and Planning and Zoning Commissioner Matt Mandel, Environmental and Land Attorney and Fairfield Planning and Zoning Commissioner Catherine Braun, State Senator from the 36th District of Greenwich, Stamford, and New Canaan, Ryan Fazio. Due to technical difficulties, the first few minutes of the webinar were not recorded. We join the webinar in progress.
They're really concerning. So we also have a bill, HB 5174, which would allow churches to build as of right up to 9 units on their property for homeless shelters without any zoning restrictions, setbacks, anything like that, without running water, without sewer, sanitation, and none of those things are indicated to be something that can be addressed by the local planning and zoning boards.
So are you thinking like these would be tent cities outside of places of worship?
Yes.
Okay.
And there hasn't been a lot of testimony provided against that in opposition. The number of people who have provided testimony against it were from COGS and such, who raised some really important concerns related to health and safety of those living there. And, sanitary facilities, utility connections, food preparation and storage, solid waste. So there's a lot of, significant concerns on just allowing something like that to happen. Another bill is the ability to a study that's going to go against design review in historic districts. So we have historic districts throughout the state, and now the idea is that that's not okay, that we don't really want to have review, that we don't want to have, because that might add some cost to development if you're trying to keep with the design district look. And and those are very specific standards that are set by each community. And I think that that's one of those things that are greatly cherished by each of our communities. So the idea that you can remove your review of such things in an area, or potentially have a property like this bulldozed, is very concerning. And the reality is that 830G already allows for the override of design review in historic areas, from my understanding. So this is really an attempt to just be able to build more and quickly, and to not have to build affordable, is really what this is asking to do, and at the same time sacrifice our historical assets within our communities.
Yeah. We have a question, Maria. I just want to go back to the bill where you could have essentially tents outside of different properties, the church properties. And then someone is asking, now who would manage those sites on the church properties if you could have up to 9 units there? Is there any language in the bill that would indicate that?
I am not as familiar with who would manage that. I mean, there is obviously still, because it is as of right, it would just mean that the town facilities would still go through. So the Board of Health would, I think, still go through and everything. But there are significant issues, because you're treating churches different than you would treat a single family or another property. So there are some potential constitutionality issues related to this bill as well, as to whether such a overreach is appropriate, where you're not going through your normal process.
Great. Then we have a question. I do want to go, because this is a more interactive session tonight. And we have a question from someone, John. Is there an affordable housing need in Connecticut, or is this just really a perennial problem that is being rebranded for political reasons? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, affordable housing is needed in this state. There's no doubt about it. I think everybody has come to that conclusion. It's just a matter of how do you institute it, how do you create it, and then of course the number and whether or not the state should be telling the towns what to do. Now, just to let you know where we are in Westport, we just created an affordable housing fund where at this point, anybody who does any future development has to pay a percentage of that development into a fund that we can do it. And why did we create it? Well, our neighbors Fairfield had already done it, and our neighbors down the road, New Canaan, had already done it. So you've got a number of towns that are already doing affordable housing and trying to create it on their own. So we're trying to meet the need that we can, establish ourselves without the state coming in and saying, you have to do it this way, this way, this way, such as 830G, or in some of the other bills where they're saying you can do an as of right multifamily housing units if you do it with 30% affordable. It may not be in the right place. So the point is, instead of all these bills, the states should be looking at how can we take money from the state and give it to the towns that want to actually do the affordable housing and let them do it.
Right.
It's interesting. I'll bring it up now that there was a study on segregation that was done in our state, and I believe Rojas was saying, we were trying to answer this question of the fact that they've always funded the cities for grants and low interest loans and the vouchers and low income housing tax credits, that they get the lion's share of all of that. And as a result, a lot of the development of all of the affordable has been in a handful of the largest cities. And you can see that if you go on our 830G spreadsheet that's on our website as well, where you can see the amount of units that there are of vouchers. And there's an enormous discrepancy in the way funds are allocated to these largest cities. And I'm not saying that there isn't a need. I'm just saying that there's got to be a way. It's hard to point a finger at other towns that have high land costs, that have high development costs, that have limited access to available land, and say, why don't you also have 10% when these other locations have all received a great deal of funding, and it's not been done in the same way to these smaller towns that have less access to resources. And I think that that's a really important distinction. And so in that report, it seems to say that there's a low or medium correlation, maybe not a causation for concentration of poverty, but I would argue that maybe they didn't really consider all the different buckets of funding that comes just to these handfuls of communities. And if you really consider that there, and the fact that now housing authorities prevent in many ways have been an obstacle for movement and portability of vouchers. And because of the challenges related to it, that I think that that's a dangerous path to go down, and that we need to do better, and we need to reform vouchers as well.
Right. And I did put the study that Maria was referencing, that the state did pay for a study on segregation, and we're coming through it as CT169Strong, and we're going to put out some commentary and our thoughts on that as well. We did notice at first blush that unfortunately no local officials or P&Z folks were interviewed for this study. So feel like that's a big loss of important voices. I do want to bring it over to Catherine Braun, who is in her car tonight. Good to see you, Kathy. And you always bring the environmental voice to things as an environmental lawyer. Can you talk about some of the environmental issues with some of the bills? I know there's one on inland wetlands that is of concern.
So the inland wetlands one, which is it ends in 5475, HB 5475. That would basically not just roll back protections for wetlands, but also roll back the ability of people to appeal into court adverse decisions on wetlands or zoning. They would have to show actual harm when that's a logical impossibility, because when there's an approval of a project, the harm doesn't happen until you build the project. That could be a couple of years later. So you'll never be able to prove it. You'll never be able to go to court. It could also affect the ability of people to file environmental interventions by preventing people from having the ability to appeal. there are many other issues that come up in all the bills. Those are very specific bill provisions to that one bill 5475. But many of the bills have provisions which eliminate the public voice, the voice of the people that live nearby who know best what the issues are with the land and the topography and the infrastructure, by eliminating the right to have a public hearing to begin with. So if there's no public hearing, that also affects environmental protection, because right now, if there's a proceeding, you can intervene into it, whether it's at the local level or the state level. The law is called 22A-19. If, however, you get rid of a hearing, I don't know if there's any proceeding you can intervene into to raise environmental issues. There are a number of letters which I advise anyone to read. A lot of green organizations have written letters. So there's been an awakening. And I would recommend that anyone who has an environmental interest write letters on all the bills, because any bill that eliminates the right to have a public hearing, it also eliminates the right to raise environmental issues. And there's been a number of green groups: Save the Sound, Rivers Alliance, League of Conservation Voters, the Watershed Trade Association, that the Water Company Trade Association is concerned, as well as the Association of Zoning Officials and the Association of Wetlands Officials. That bill cannot pass. That would eviscerate so many things about environmental protection, not just with wetlands, but with zoning as well. Because as I pointed out in my testimony, wetlands agencies only govern wetlands. They're not allowed to regulate other land that's not the wetland or the buffer area around it. So that is left to zoning. And this also eviscerates or eliminates basically the ability of anyone to file a zoning appeal. So zoning would help you preserve open space. We in Fairfield have an open space set aside provision in our regulations. So zoning does have environmental impact, and zoning does have the ability to preserve and protect the environment. And going over to the historic preservation, many of these bills would conflict with other existing laws that already exist, such as historic commissions. That's a separate law, such as wetlands laws or other environmental laws. They would also conflict with the 5-year green plan that the state has implemented. And in the green plan, the state wants to preserve 21% of all land in the state as open space. We're not on target to do that. I saw a Council of Environmental Quality report from a couple of years ago that said it will take 65 years to do it. And I know in Fairfield, we instituted one of the very first open space programs 50 years ago, and we're supposed to do 21% also. We might be less than half that. So if it took 50 years to get that far, we're not going to get there if we don't have laws that promote protection of open space and protection of wetlands, not that roll back the ability of the public to raise issues, or that really allow development without regulation.
Yeah, Kathy,
Many
maybe
of
as
the bills have a
a zoning.
component.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that great answer. Can you describe what as of right means to people? Because you're a zoning commissioner, you hear those words a lot. Everybody may not be familiar with that.
It means that if somebody checks all the right boxes, their project will be basically rubber stamped by the staff in the zoning office. And if you're going to make every single project go through staff, you're going to have to balloon your staff up, okay? Because they're going to have to be doing a whole lot more work. But the commission are elected officials in our town, and most towns, some are appointed, but they are accountable to the people in the community who know what goes on in the community. We know the unique infrastructure constraints. You know what the traffic congestion is. So you want to have local officials accountable that are also knowledgeable of what is going on. Land is a unique resource and asset. It's not like a manufactured good. I heard somebody try to say we should treat land like a manufactured good. It's not a manufactured good. It can't be moved. And everything you do affects the land next door. So it is uniquely local, and it absolutely requires local decision-making to preserve our natural and our historic resources.
Thank you. We have another question from Yvonne Klein. Aren't you omitting the fact that a public hearing will be held on the front end rather than the back end and establish these regulations? this is how single family homes are built as of right. The regs established on the front end, not the back end. Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to take that one. The difference between a as of right for a single family that may be on a sewer, a septic, and a well is not doing the same sort of impact as something that is on town water, town sewer, which is high density. So I think you have to consider all of those impacts. That is really the largest distinction there. And I think Catherine really highlighted the points of traffic and safety, and all of the other things that these commissions look at very specifically to make sure that we are aligned in and making sure that we are good stewards of our land and that we protect what we have. It's another misconception that's often put out there that 91% of land in Connecticut is single family. Well, by nature, multifamily does not take up as much room. And you also have to look at a map that shows you where you have sewer and where you have town water, because that severely limits where you can build higher density as well. And when we don't have infrastructure funding to do these kinds of expansions, and when you look at some of these alternative systems that Francis Pickering spoke about on one of the roundtables and mentioned how they're just not quite there yet with technology. And many times when you have private community septic systems, they tend to fail. And when they fail, it's on the municipality to do the environmental cleanup that happens. So we have to move cautiously with this. And I think that's probably enough of that answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Again, I do want to welcome.
If we can
Oh,
extend on that idea of as of right. So let's say you take 5390, which is creating a zone within the TOD, and you create the zone and you're thinking, okay, we're going to go and do this so that we can create the middle housing that is so desirable that everybody wants to do. But tucked into it as well is the as of right to build an apartment building with 30% affordable. So when you're doing that, you're coming to the idea, it's like, okay, we'll buy into this idea of creating 4 units per building, 5 units over here. So we're creating smaller housing, a little more dense in the area. But then suddenly there's this as of right piece. So you're going forward thinking that, hey, we're going to do this and we're going to take a few acres and we're going to bring 20, 50 units into this area. Suddenly someone could buy it and say, hey, I'm doing this as of right, and put in 150, 200 without the P&Z being able to say anything about it. And so what happens to water? What happens to sewer? What happens to schools? What happens to all the other infrastructure that's necessary to make something work? There is a drive to have it be as of right so that the public and that the P&Z never gets a say in doing anything. And that's just not the way we're supposed to be governing. We're supposed to allow the local government to decide, hey, this is what we want to do. And we do have towns that actually want to do these things, but they shouldn't be blindsided by anything that's as of right. Let it come through the process. If you have towns that want to do it, they will execute it. But when you have towns that don't want to do it, that's their business. But the ones that do shouldn't be blindsided. And that's the problem with all of this drive for as of right.
Great, thank you. And I do want to welcome Senator Ryan Fazio, who joined us. Welcome. I know you had a long day in Hartford, so we're very appreciative of your time as always.
Yeah, great to be here as always. Thanks for inviting me. As you mentioned, I just got back to the district from Hartford after a lot of public hearings today, and I'll also be testifying on a bill that I think takes away some local decision-making powers on GAE. Unfortunately, I'm the 110th person in the list to testify out of 110, so I will probably not be on there until the midnight Zoom.
We've all been there.
We've all been there. The funny thing is normally legislators are putting the first 10 or 15 people. So, I don't know what happened there, but nonetheless, it's
Sure, it was a mere oversight.
I
was
157th one time on it. And
well, I'll let you know how 110
7
is.
in the morning, and at 7 in the morning, they still hadn't gotten to me, and then ended at noon and never got to me. So sometimes
it's tough, but it is an interesting session. So happy to give my impression of what the session is. It being
can you do that, Ryan? Do you have a
sure? Well, last session was very eventful on the front, on the housing and planning and development front. everything from housing and zoning issues and beyond, because it was a long session and there was, I think, a significant appetite among the majority leaders of both houses to do something significant on housing. 169 strong and many legislators were very strong in their opposition to some of the most radical pieces of legislation, especially the Fair Share Act, which would have been an enormously detrimental and enormously aggressive overhaul of zoning and local decision making, essentially doing away with local zoning and imposing a taxpayer liability on municipalities to build the housing, and essentially doubling the 830G mandate as the end goal, but probably even worse than that. That's probably an underestimation of what it truly did. That bill was watered down significantly, and the efforts to revive it fully might come next year after an election. And similarly, work, live, ride in a much more stronger instantiation was stopped last year, as it was the year before. I remember our public hearing on that was till the wee hours of the morning last year. This year it's been, I would say, tamped down in what it is, but I still voted against it in the Planning and Development Committee last week. It would require that towns opt into a transit-oriented community that allows as of right development within a half mile of transit stations, a bus station or a train station, and it would give them priority in certain quote-unquote discretionary infrastructure funding in order to reward them for it. Of course, that means it would deprioritize towns that don't opt into what I think is a very, very highly permissive zoning regime in order to qualify or be qualify for prioritization. The problem is that the funding streams are pretty significant and broad and highly discretionary, that you would either be prioritized or deprioritized, and they include something called Urban Act funds, which consisted of $200 million, essentially of bonding funding last year. That kind of encompasses all sorts of bonding that goes to localities and communities around the state, towns and cities alike. So I think that was far too broad, and and in order to meet those qualifications, it was far too permissive or prescriptive a zoning requirement, an upzoning requirement. So although the bill was less bad than it had been in years past, I still had enormous reticence, and there was strong opposition to the bill in the Planning and Development Committee, but it ultimately passed along party lines. There's a couple of other bills that are very concerning this year as well. I still think there's an effort to pass something allowing housing authorities to operate, to develop in other towns without the locality's approval, the target locality's approval. That seems to be migrating into different bills, that section. And there's a couple other dummy bills, which are kind of receptacles for content later on that are still floating around, and there's a couple of, shall we say, omnibus type housing bills, SB6, another bill for the House majority, that are still floating around, haven't got as much attention. I think what you'll likely see is something similar to last year, where we won't know until last couple of weeks of April what ultimately the final product is that the leadership of both houses are getting behind. And so until then, we're dealing with a lot of different concepts and a lot of different vehicles that we have mostly paid attention to and latched on to the ones that are kind of standalone, have gotten a lot of attention on their own, including Work, Live, Ride. But this session, I think it's as or more likely than last time that what we'll see is ultimately a final package put together by leadership, combining many different concepts that we're not quite sure about and won't be until it's released outside of the House Democratic Caucus in towards the end of April. So, we're on our front foot. We think we've paid attention to all these bills, many of which are bad, some of which contain concepts that I think are reasonable and should be explored and expanded. And again, this year, similar to previous years, I submitted legislation with one of my Democratic colleagues, Representative Ali Brennan from Bethel, to reform 830G, put communities, localities in the driver's seat, but also create fertile ground for development of more housing, especially affordable and workforce housing, the missing middle of housing. So, and I should also report, I do think that many who have been, who have disagreed with, some of us on the desire to maintain certain levels of local discretion. I think the conversation has been better in the past 6 to 9 months since that majority leader's task force was actually enacted. I think there is a sense that 830G hasn't been highly effective in meeting the goals of the housing goals, to say nothing of the fact that it's created a lot of a very adversarial relationship between municipalities and the state. So I also think there's an appreciation that the workforce housing, the middle housing, the more discrete kind of decentralized development, like accessory dwelling units, like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, like more residential and mixed use commercially zoned areas. I think there's an appreciation that that is an avenue forward, that is part of the solution, that could be more attainable both politically and practically. But there also has to be an agreement that we can have no reasonable discussion of fair share, and that there needs to be a significant rollback and reform to 830G in order to achieve that. So my goal in the next couple of years genuinely would be to forge a compromise where we could protect all these different considerations and give communities, give localities more discretion, but also create more affordability in our housing, also create more housing generally. So now working on this for 3 years, I'm starting to see more and more where I hope there will be compromise that's bipartisan, that includes cities and towns and both rural towns and suburbs, but doesn't bring a heavy hand down on our localities who have very, very serious concerns and considerations about more centralized power and decision making. So, that was a very high level overview of where things have come, where they are, and where they might go. But this will all come to a head pretty quickly in the next 6 weeks because the session ends, I believe, on May 7th.
Yeah,
I would just add there's one more thing in that transit-oriented community bill. The last section was a little sweetheart added in there, that any property owner of in a transit-oriented district who owns it for more than 3 years can construct an accessory apartment as of right. So it's interesting because we had this bill come through I think it was 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, where all the towns, I think it was 2 years ago, where the towns could opt out of, so you were told that you should have allowed TOD everywhere and parking regulations. And a lot of communities decided to opt out, mainly because you don't want to treat everything equally in any town. In particular, if you think about a city like Stamford, there are so many very different areas to Stamford. How could you just have one specific policy that really works and fits in every single situation? And I think that many of Fairfield County towns decided to opt out of that legislation. And I think I read today, it came across, someone texted me an article that Darien is looking into. They're allowing as of, these ADU units, but there are certain areas that are really impacted by flooding and issues with parking in those places where they've decided to not allow it for that one specific reason. And again,
we do that in Fairfield too. We don't allow them in their area. Yeah.
And so I think this is it highlights the reason why it's important to allow those local leaders to make these decisions, because they're the ones who are, in the end of the day, the real stewards of proper land use, and making sure that our we are taking care of what we have, and ensuring that everyone these projects are managed well and intelligently and effectively. So I think that that's an important consideration that we need to remember as we look at these one-size-fits-all policies in these bills that are coming through, especially the ones where there's a point system and with some onerous sort of concepts that they would like towns to adopt in order to get a point. So I would just I'll pass it on now. Sorry.
You bring up the ADUs in 5390, and it's not just that you can do it as of right, but that you can then sell it, which is an incredible miss in terms of legality, because what are you selling? Just the house? Or are you selling a piece of the land? How big is the piece of the land? And now you're creating, nonconformities with the other house. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Westport adopted an ADU regulation. We opted out of the states because it was too onerous. They would be too close to the road. They'd be too monolithic looking. And we created one that seems to be reasonable for us, and people are building them. There's a question here that was talking about the percentage of affordability, 30%. So Westport has inclusionary zoning, that anytime you build any type of multifamily housing, 20% of it needs to be affordable. And that's the most aggressive in the state. There are other towns around us that are moving up from 10% to 12 to 13, but we're sitting at 20. And talking about the return on investment, we found that they have been able to do it in Westport. And because our land is expensive, but also the rents are that much more, so that they can do it, and we can get people in here that need affordable housing through our aggressive inclusionary zoning. And if you add in what we're doing with the Affordable Housing Fund, we'll be able to do it. And I think that's where what Senator is talking about is finding a compromise, finding a way for the towns who want to do it to be able to do it without having the state make the choice for you. And I keep asking, why not the carrot instead of the stick? So in 5390, where you're talking about your opt-in, it's really not an opt-in, because if you don't opt in, now you're deprioritized from doing things. Now, thankfully, they pulled brownfields out. Could you imagine you're a town that doesn't want to do the TOD, but you have a brownfield and they're saying, oh, sorry, you're not doing the TOD, so we're not going to give you money for your brownfield. But there are other things that might be needed, other types of infrastructure that would work. So the point is, it should be a carrot. Now, the interesting thing, if I could go further, you have live, work, ride, or work, live, ride, whichever way you want to do it. It doesn't matter. You can juggle it around. There already exists something that does the same concept. It's the Municipal Redevelopment Authority and Affordable Housing Development. Why are we creating a whole nother piece of legislation when one already exists? One that doesn't use a stick, it's a carrot. You want to do it, and you can create your own housing growth zone, and it's aided by the state to help you design it, do it, and they will then give you money to execute it. That's the way it should be done. And I think that's the problem here when you have a piece of legislation that really is going to conflict with something that's already here that people can adopt if they want to do it. And if you don't want to, you don't have to opt in. So I think that's what the senator was talking about. Let's find the compromise so that we can aid towns that want to do it and not punish those that don't. And they'll figure it out in the long run. They're all going to come along and it'll be taken care of. I think that's what we need to find is the compromise to bring all the parties together. Let's stop, left and right here. Let's find the center and work together on the resolution to help the state move forward.
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. We have a question here. What constitutes as affordable? Maria, do you want to, or whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
That's another issue, the definition of affordable, because 8-30G has its definition. 8-30G was passed in 1989 as the goal was to get developers to create affordable housing by incentivizing them by sort of removing any kind of most zoning controls. So if you're a developer, you can build whatever you want, wherever you want, how big you want, any coverage, not enough parking, whatever you want to do, you can do, so long as 30% of the units in that development are affordable. And how they define affordable is if a person at 80% of the median area income would spend 30% of their income on rents. That would be affordable units have to have a deed restriction for 40 years. So that, unfortunately, that's the definition that is being used in, in all the bills, I think, and I don't know why we're ignoring other types of affordable housing that might exist naturally that are not classified as 8-30G. 8-30G also includes tenant assistance, Section 8 vouchers, CHAFA, down payment assistance loans, and also government supplied housing projects. And it's a restrictive definition. And what it does is it omits already existing duplexes and triplexes in a modest part of town. And we do find that 8-30G incentivizes developers to mow those down, get rid of the middle housing that exists naturally that fits into the neighborhood, and build these massive out of scale developments, because that's how they make up for the affordable rents. They have to build up and build out to have market rate rents. So that's the definition that's used all around. I don't know why. It doesn't have to be used.
Right. Thanks. I had a question, and this could be just a question for the panel. And maybe perhaps more for the senator. Do you sense that there's some recognition from your colleagues who may not be in Fairfield County, especially, that a lot of towns are doing the work? I'll reference Fairfield because I live here. We've updated our regulations for ADUs a few times. We first had them in the 80s before a lot of towns did. We have an inclusionary zoning. We have an affordable housing fund. We, as zoning commissioners, Kathy and I, collectively, we all work with developers to make sure that there is affordable in the apartment buildings that we are passing or approving. So, is there any recognition on that?
I think there's more recognition than there used to be. And I think part of the reason is because when you have some of these more unfortunate proposals that get raised for a public hearing, that we see so many of our local leaders in Lower Fairfield County come up to the Capitol to testify during those public hearings that last a long time. And there are legislators that, maybe aren't as sensitive to the issue, or, see things a different way, that when they hear from some of the very informed and involved members of local government or of the communities down in Fairfield County, that they're, and how they are being more assertive to try to create affordable housing in their communities, there becomes a greater appreciation. When people talk, I think better things happen. When people just go to their corners, then I think you see greater acrimony and worse outcomes. When people talk, I do think better things happen. And just by virtue of all the local leaders, the community leaders from Fairfield County who have come up to testify about how they have been assertive in trying to create more affordable housing in Fairfield County, I think there has been a growing appreciation from many of the legislators elsewhere in the state who might not always agree with us for the efforts that are being made. I can think specifically of some of the zoning officials in Westport coming last year to speak. I can think of the zoning officials in Greenwich, my district, coming to speak. The testimonials of the Housing Authority in New Canaan, which has built 100 affordable units in Canaan Parish, Fairfield, others, who are really putting a foot forward. I think, again, the ADU policy in many of our towns, including Greenwich, is very liberal. Darien, Westport are building a lot more housing downtown, near transit areas, near mixed use retail areas, and so forth. So I think the more we show up, and this is a lesson every year going forward, the more we show up and just testify to what exactly is happening in our communities, what the exact considerations are, what the affirmative steps being taken are to create a better housing market, I think then you can find more common ground. We can turn down the temperature. We can reduce the likelihood of some of the most radical pieces of legislation passing, and hopefully eventually a positive compromise being brokered here that improves housing affordability and also respects local input and local considerations. So I would say there's still, everyone is busy, everyone is focused on their own districts, and that's unfair because oftentimes those are legislators who are seeking to impose their will on other parts of the state without being fully informed of what's happening there. But I also think that if we show up, if we give testimony about what is being done in our communities, to actually try to protect all interests, including affordability and including local discretion, then I do think we have stand a chance at stopping the worst instincts in Hartford, but also creating good legislation in the end.
And I want to just circle back 1 second, because I know we started out early with like, is there an affordable housing need? Is there, and so as we're talking about what's affordable, in that definition, they take into account your energy costs, your utility costs, and they take out into your account your taxes as well. So if you consider how property taxes factor in, your local property taxes and your energy costs figure into your monthly cost of living, and so when you think about the number that they're putting out there, that people are cost burdened because they're paying more than 30% of their salary toward their living expenses, and some of that is a choice because you choose to be closer to maybe you commute to New York and you want to be closer and have less of a commute, or it may be a little bit further away because you want to have more land, or and then that drops your cost a little bit. So I mean, these are all independent decisions that people make. So the challenge though is that our homeless number is a little bit over 3,000. So saying that there's so many costs burdened just by creating market value high density rentals is not going to solve the cost burden for those people who are living in a home and have a high mortgage and and utility costs. And that has to do with other policies at the state level. And when you think about Fairfield County and its proximity to the economic engine of New York, there's a bifurcation that happens in our state. So of course, our rental costs are higher. Our property values are higher because we draw people who work in New York who can get higher salaries, and that sort of factors into our communities as well. So there was an interesting article that talked about like you can keep building rental units in Stanford, but they're still not going to the cost of those rentals in Stanford are not going to come down significantly because there's this demand, because people are moving in this direction. So the numbers that we look at are numbers from 2000, and I as a realtor I will mention that New Canaan made news years ago because we had so many homes on the market and so many for sale signs that at one point we decided to take down all of our for sale signs, and that made national news because it really wasn't a good look. It took a global pandemic for us to clear our inventory post the Great Recession. So there's this is another concept that's in that segregation study that says that there's been less permits issued in that period from 2010 to 2020. Well, that's all post Great Recession, where we were trying to absorb all of that excess inventory, and so markets are cyclical, and we hope that that we're going to have more inventory coming out and that rates will come down at some point soon, which will hopefully loosen up the market a little bit more. But you have to remember that all of these factor in, and we understand that there are people who are struggling. It is not easy with all the inflation that's happened. So we do understand that there's an affordability issue, but there's a lot of things that we need to do, and truly the only way to really improve affordability is to improve jobs and to improve outcomes for people and to have better economic opportunities. And that's been a little inconsistent in our state, and that's something that has to get addressed as well.
I do want to, Maria makes very good points, because a lot of these economic factors are interconnected, and so much of the debate about housing has been regarding zoning when there are a lot of other factors at play. There's a interesting New York Times study from a year or two ago comparing property taxes by state, and it has Connecticut, I think, second, third highest in the country, maybe after New Jersey, at around 2.3, 2.2% of the value of the home, the assessed value of the home, compared to the average state's probably around 1%. So you're looking at double the property taxes in percentage terms. If you take what about 1% of the value of the average home is in Connecticut, you're looking at a few $1,000s. And that's an enormously costly burden for the average person to pick up, either in their property tax bill or through their rent, because we all know that a landlord will pass those costs directly to a renter. So people are paying thousands of dollars more than the average state in their property taxes, directly or indirectly, which makes it much less affordable to be here. And the Planning and Development Committee, and I've said it repeatedly, should be focused on all the ways in which the state government drives up the costs of local government in the state by imposing hundreds of unfunded mandates on the towns and cities, including some that are related to construction. Closed union shop requirements that could raise the cost of building things by 30%, according to some studies. Project labor agreements. You have. We just dealt with we're dealing with a public project in our quasi-public project in Greenwich right now that its initial price tag was 30 million. And then when it got a state grant that triggered prevailing wage, it was looking at a $36 million cost. So a lot of these state regulations that we don't talk about on a daily basis, but have been passed over the course of decades, substantially raise the cost of everything, including housing, including property taxes and the state energy costs. I'm also the ranking member of the Energy Committee, in addition to the Planning and Development Committee. And I'm pretty sure that if I had, say, more power than I do now, that I could lop off about 10% of your electricity bill in a couple of years, and more 10 years down the line. I'm very highly confident of that. And then beyond that, you have other things like, the cost of building housing is mostly going to be in labor and materials. And how are we getting, a skilled construction workforce into this state to the maximum extent possible? Well, we have a cap on apprenticeships in this state. So people can't go into the trades, even if they want to, even if they're a pretty good wage, even if there's a high degree of demand, because the state caps the number of apprentices at 3 journeymen, 3 full-time workers to 1 apprentice in general, even though on the work site, it only caps it at 1 to 1. So it's not anything about safety. It's about reducing access to those industries. I also have a bill that I'm probably most optimistic about this year to cut licensing fees on licensed workers. So you have contractors who are forced to pay. These are mid-wage workers, right? But skilled workers, mid-wage workers, middle-class people who have to pay $500 to $600 just to renew their license to the state government every single year, even though they're qualified to work. Well, we're pushing those people out of the state. We're making it more expensive. We're passing those costs along to renters and buyers. And so I have a bill to cut that to $100. It passed through the General Law Committee. I'm very hopeful that it'll actually be able to pass into law this year or next year. But there's a lot of ways to make it more affordable in the state, including making housing more affordable. We've been so zoned in, maybe on zoning, that we've lost, I think, some perspective of all the other economic factors that drive costs higher, including in this state. And I think if we take a broad approach, we pick all the right policy levers, we can actually make it more affordable, in addition to making some of the right public housing decisions, making some of the right zoning decisions, improving them, trading a little 830G for a little middle housing and so on. So, these are issues that, again, the more time I spend on them over the last, and, Maria and others and I have been having these conversations since I first ran almost 4 years ago, about 4 years ago is when I first announced to run. And I've learned so much more in 4 years, and I'm actually so much more encouraged at the possibility of finding happy outcomes. I think we just got to bring people together. Sometimes people are forced to come together if, shall we say, the political mathematics lend themselves to it, rather than very large majorities, governing majorities in state government. But I do think that there are more areas of commonality than I initially thought, and I do think that there are many, many different levers to make things more affordable than simply zoning or simply public housing investments. So again, the more time I spend on this, I see the light, but it's at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel's pretty.
Got it. Thanks. Thank you. That's a perfect segue into the next question. How do towns get the money to build their own affordable housing rather than depending on a developer to build it?
I'll take that. It's the affordable housing funds that New Canaan, Fairfield, Greenwich, and Westport have, and a number of other towns. And it basically comes from a fee. It can come from many ways. It can come from a fee from development. In Westport, it's 0.5%. So if you're going to put in, let's say, $100,000 pool in your place, you have to put $500 into the kitty. If you're going to build $1 million house and it costs you $1 million, then you have to put $5,000 in. Mathematically, Westport's on a goal of getting $750,000 to $1 million a year through this to then fund affordable housing. We can also get grants. We can get some federal money as well. We can take in donations to augment this. So if people are very interested in affordable housing, it's tax deductible. If you give money to this to our town, I figure it's all towns, but at least if you give a donation to Westport for affordable housing, it's tax deductible. One thing that I've been working on, and it really hits the towns with more value, or the towns that are a little more well off, and that is the conveyance tax. There's a mansion conveyance tax. So from below $1.5 million, it's 0.75%. But once you get over $1.5 million for a house, and in Westport, that's pretty much the norm. And some people may find that hard to swallow, but that is the case. It is the case in probably in Darien and Greenwich and New Canaan as well. But once you get after 1.5 million, it goes up to 1.5%. If you get a house that's $2.5 million, then it goes up to 2.25%. My idea here is to take half of that money and send it right back to any town that has an affordable housing fund to fill it and then to build it. The state is so hot to have the richer communities build the affordable housing. Well, then it's time for the state to put their money where their mouth is and send that money back to directly be able to do that. So those are the different things how we can raise the money. But what can we do? We could buy a piece of land and give it to our housing authority. We could take town-owned property that we think should be affordable instead of it sitting there doing nothing at the moment and turn it into affordable housing and adaptively reuse these places. We can also, if we're having someone who's coming in, let's say in Westport, they're going to build 10 units and 2 of them are going to be affordable. We pay the developer to buy it down so that we get 3 or 4 units into it. So there's a number of ways once you have the money to be able to create the affordable housing. Now, a lot of the bills, and I think it was Maria brought it up, they're all talking about density, and that's going to solve the problem. Density doesn't solve the affordability problem because its trickle down is not really going to occur. You have to actually be building the affordable housing specifically, and that's where these funds, and the one that I'm proud to have been part of creating, it can do it. And I think that's one of the things that we should be focusing on.
There's also low-income housing tax credits, which is where some other company corporation gets a tax credit, and those towns get the funding. It's run through, I believe, the Treasury Department, if I'm correct. And so when those funds come in, they can then use those as the down payment. Now, if it's a 4% low-income housing tax credit, that covers about 30% of your development costs. And then if it's a 9% low-income housing tax credit, that can cover up to 70%. But those are extremely competitive to get those. There's only a limited number of 9% tax credit, low-income housing tax credit programs offered. And so that gets more challenging, and most of the, I think those tend to go mostly to the cities, and they usually like to have higher developments with larger numbers of units and with a lower per unit cost. And those tend to be a little bit harder to do in towns that are smaller, which was one of the things that came up in one of our local discussions on our affordable housing committee in New Canaan, where we talked about how ideally you don't really want to do much more than 20 units or so if possible. It's just the way towns are settled. In a city, you can do higher developments in certain areas, but that's not the same in all areas. And your infrastructure, not just your sewer, but your water, your roads, your transit, all of those things have have to factor in as to how much density you can really take on. And I think that's the unfortunate thing in looking at that report, going back to that segregation study. I think it really didn't delve into those differences between these smaller towns and how they don't have the infrastructure and, you know, access to transit and maybe even wide enough roads to like handle the extra density of travel. So I think those are all considerations that are best made locally, and the reason why you really want to work closely and hand in hand with these communities as they try to help create more affordability in their towns.
Well, the
And
whole
Maria, while I
concept
have
of-
you, oh,
I'm
go ahead,
sorry.
Matt.
Well, I was
Go
going to say that's the whole concept of you're going to decrease parking so that they don't have cars because it's going to be a walkable community. But you're going to plop it down by a train station. There may not be any of the other infrastructure necessary to live there. And I say this a number of times, and it's if the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker aren't there, where are they? They could be 2 miles away. How are they going to get there? They need a car. Now, again, you have a married couple. So one may be going into the city, but the other one may not be. So they need a car to get there, to pick up the kids, to move them around, to bring them to the baseball practice, to then go shopping, to bring the kid to the ballet class. So the point is that you can't decrease the parking when the communities are built as they are. That doesn't mean that you can't bring some more affordable housing and more housing into these areas, but you can't have a two-tiered system where some people have cars and places to park and some people don't. It doesn't work. So it's not really one size fits all, but it's something wrong with the thinking and thinking we're going to do this. You can't do it by fiat. It has to be organically created. And it can't be like, we're just going to do this now and you'll figure it out. It's just not going to work. It has to be done from the local level up rather than up to the local level.
Thanks.
Sir, I just want to add one other thing. You know, maybe I've been the most Pollyannish, more Pollyannish than usual, but there is a bill that Representative Tom O'Day from New Canaan, Stamford, and Darien was the primary author of in planning and development that I'm hopeful we can pass out of planning and development, which would make I would say, middle income and higher income municipalities eligible for transit oriented development funding from the state. So, you know, if the towns do prefer it, they could avail themselves of certain state funds to create that. I think that is fair because you see a lot of the sticks imposed on certain towns and cities, while the carrots, you know, all go to towns and cities, or mostly cities, where there isn't the same stick, there isn't the same statutory requirements or mandates that housing get built. So, you know, if you want it to get built in places where you're mandating, you should probably also have some sort of incentive that's streamlined, that's not excessive, but helps move, you know, the housing ball forward. So I think there are so many different funding streams for housing. Some of it's discretionary, you know, it's too much to remember, but having it probably more neatly organized, streamlined, fair in the extent to which things are subsidized and eligible to more towns and cities, I think would be a better alternative.
Yeah. I did want to go back to Maria really quickly, or Ryan. What was the cost to construct the Canaan Parish development that was 100% affordable?
Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure, but I would say, you know, I think when we were looking at these, we're ballparking around 500 to 600,000 a unit. It is expensive to build.
Yeah, it is expensive, and that's something that I think people need to dig into. There's public housing that's been built in Greenwich that was about 600 per unit as well, and that's far above market. You know, the units were maybe like 1,000 square feet, so they were a little bit bigger, but it still strikes me as very high, too high, and I'm sure there's state regulations that make it higher than it needs to be, which of course, you know, begs the question, do you really believe in affordable housing if you're imposing all these mandates and regulations that make it 50% more expensive to build than it should be? So it's a problem. It's a problem. I mean, there's, you know, the natural forces of the market. It's much more expensive to build the past few years, but, you know, 600,000 per unit strikes me as above market.
You know, Dana Benson brings up a good question. Would it have been cheaper to subsidize landlords to rent at below the market? Well, it's interesting, but I know that Francis Pickering from Westcog had organized a study to see if even towns within the Westcog area are able to meet their 830G 10%, or is it even attainable? Because many of these communities, and I won't go into it here, we've talked about this and probably ad nauseum, but we really have to focus on that column 1 because our land cost is high, we have higher income levels, so we don't have different things like we don't get as many of those CHAFA loans, or we don't have farmland, and we also don't get the vouchers from the state. We have 33 when New Haven has 7,000 over that. And so, those are all factors that impact how you can get to a 10% number that's calculated in a very tortured way. And so I think it's important to, he's actually now looking at different alternatives. And I think that report's going to be coming out very soon. So I think Fairfield County towns, or those within Westcog, should take a look at that, because I think there will be some very interesting, unique solutions. Some of them may not apply if you wanted to try to get a moratorium, but only 11 towns have ever done it anyway. But there are different alternatives to buying, to creating new, and oftentimes it's buying something that's already existing, given the current cost, the five L's of lumber, land, loans, and the laws and everything. All of that comes together, labor. All of that comes together to make the cost so high right now that if you can buy an existing and refurbish, that sometimes that's a much better alternative than it is to buy to create new at this point, given the cost.
Yeah, we are past 8 o'clock, and I want to be cognizant of everybody's schedules and times. I know we're about 7-8 weeks away from the end of the session. Can maybe everyone comment on, or Maria, Ryan, how do we keep engaged? How do we stay engaged with our legislators as these bills progress and get towards the end of the tunnel, to use Ryan's words? What do we do? How can we stay connected?
Well, follow, subscribe at CT169Strong.org. They didn't tell me to say that, but they're as good as anyone at tracking the substance of what's happening at the state level, which is difficult to track. They track it better than I do. I can only track what's going on my committee most of the time, and it's very difficult, but they do the yeoman's work, and they're not funded by developers or any other interest making it possible. So follow along, support 169 Strong. They are a good government watchdog. Subscribe to my newsletter at senatorfazio.com. I try to keep people abreast of what's going on this topic, especially. And email your legislator, email your representative, no matter who it is. They should respond. I think I'm able to get to 90% of my constituent emails, but especially if it's an informal email, I think they're most likely to respond and have a conversation with them. I find that my colleagues and I are very responsive to concerns that constituents have, and ultimately your elected officials represent you, and but they can't know where you stand unless you tell them. And maybe if you as an individual tell them what you think on an issue, it won't significantly move them. But if 30 of you do so, I bet you it will.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate everybody's time tonight. Great questions. Of course, we will continue, and I will make one just request. If you guys think this content is good, if you love what we're doing at CT169 Strong, we'd appreciate a donation. There's a QR code in the corner of my backdrop, and you can also go to CT169Strong.org for a donation link as well. Again, appreciate everybody's time tonight, and we'll keep the conversation going in the next few weeks. Have a good night.